Nobody inside Berea expected the noise to get this loud this fast. 3 OTA practices. That's all it took for the entire tone around the Cleveland quarterback competition to start changing. What was supposed to be a controlled offseason with a predictable storyline suddenly feels unstable, intense, and impossible to ignore. Because right now, one quarterback is starting to force people to rethink everything they assumed was already decided. And the most surprising part is that this isn't happening because of one viral throw or one lucky practice clip floating around online. It's the consistency, the energy, the reactions from coaches, teammates, and even players standing on the sideline watching it happen in real time. There's a different kind of attention building around Shedeur Sanders right now, and reports coming out of Browns OTAs suggest this competition may be far more serious than people originally believed. Coming into the offseason, most fans assumed Deshaun Watson would naturally control the room. He's the veteran. He's the established name, and despite all the outside criticism surrounding his recent seasons, many still believe the Browns would eventually lean toward experience once practices began. But something unexpected is happening during these early sessions under Todd Monken. Instead of protecting a predetermined starter, the Browns coaching staff appears to be opening the door wider than anyone expected. And once the practices actually started, the momentum shifted quickly. Observers began noticing the same patterns over and over again. Quick decisions, tight window throws, pocket movement that looked calm instead of rushed, passes delivered with confidence instead of hesitation. For a young quarterback who entered the league with constant questions about arm strength, velocity, and NFL readiness, the early OTA reports have caught a lot of people off guard. But the throw everyone's debating isn't even the play that created the biggest reaction. Because during one sequence late in practice, a connection between Shedeur Sanders and rookie wide receiver Denzel Boston reportedly turned heads across the field. Coaches noticed it, teammates reacted to it, and Browns fans online immediately started treating it like one of those early offseason moments that people remember months later when the season finally begins. At the same time, the situation isn't nearly as simple as Shedeur good, Watson bad. That's not what's happening here. Watson has reportedly flashed real arm talent during practices too. Some throws reminded people exactly why Cleveland invested so heavily in him in the first place. But there's a major difference between occasional flashes and controlling the rhythm of an entire practice session. And right now, that difference is becoming harder to ignore. Then came the interception that split Browns media straight down the middle. Some blamed Sanders instantly, others argued the receiver caused the entire breakdown, and once the replay started circulating, fans began dissecting every tiny detail of the route, timing, and ball placement like it was already week 1 of the regular season. Suddenly, every rep started feeling important, every throw started carrying weight. And that's why these first few OTA practices matter more than people want to admit. Because sometimes quarterback competitions don't slowly develop over months. Sometimes the energy changes immediately. Sometimes one player walks into camp operating with a level of confidence that forces the entire building to pay attention whether they plan to or not. And according to everything coming out of Browns practice so far, that may be exactly what's happening right now. The first sign that something unusual was happening in Cleveland wasn't actually a throw, it wasn't a touchdown, it wasn't even one of the viral clips circulating online. It was Todd Monken's rotation pattern. Quietly, almost casually, the Browns' offensive staff revealed something that changed the entire feel of this quarterback battle. Because teams that already know who their starter is usually operate differently. When a coaching staff has privately made its decision, practices tend to follow a script. The veteran gets protected reps, the younger quarterbacks are limited to cleanup duty. The hierarchy stays obvious. Everything feels organized to avoid controversy. But through these first OTA sessions, Cleveland hasn't looked like a team trying to protect a predetermined outcome. They've looked like a staff actively searching for answers. That's what caught people's attention. Reports from practice described quarterbacks rotating between units instead of locking into fixed roles. One day a quarterback works with the first team, the next session he's mixed into another group. The structure feels intentional rather than ceremonial. And for Browns fans expecting Deshaun Watson to walk into camp as the unquestioned leader of the offense, that alone was surprising. But the bigger surprise was how Shedeur Sanders handled those opportunities. Young quarterbacks usually look different when the reps change around them. Timing gets shaky, rhythm disappears, communication slows down. But according to multiple observers at practice, Sanders didn't appear overwhelmed when working with different personnel groups. The offense reportedly stayed organized, the tempo stayed clean, and maybe most importantly, the confidence never seemed to drop. That matters more than most fans realize. Coaches pay attention to how quarterbacks stabilize a practice, not just highlight throws, not just arm strength. They look at whether the offense feels functional. Are players getting lined up correctly? Does the quarterback process quickly? Is he decisive? Does the ball come out on time? Those little details quietly determine whether a quarterback earns trust inside a building. And through 3 OTA practices, Sanders appears to be building that trust faster than expected. What makes this even more interesting is the timing. Coming into the offseason, there were still major questions surrounding his transition to the NFL. Critics questioned whether his game would translate. Some doubted his velocity. Others wondered whether he relied too heavily on structure in college. But early reports from Browns practices are beginning to challenge some of those narratives. Instead of looking hesitant, Sanders reportedly looks aggressive. Instead of checking the ball down constantly, he's attacking windows over the middle. Instead of drifting under pressure, he's stepping into throws. That's the kind of development coaches want to see immediately because it suggests the player isn't simply surviving the system, he's starting to own it. Meanwhile, Todd Monken's approach continues sending a very specific message. He isn't handing out ceremonial reps to create off-season headlines. He appears to be forcing genuine competition. Every quarterback is being evaluated. Every session matters. And once a coaching staff creates that environment, players inside the locker room notice quickly. Veterans notice who commands the huddle. Receivers notice who delivers catchable footballs consistently. Defensive players notice which quarterbacks are hardest to disguise coverage against. Momentum inside a quarterback battle often starts quietly before the public fully catches on. And that's exactly why these rotations suddenly feel important, because this no longer looks like a rookie simply attending camp for development purposes. It's starting to look like a young quarterback actively forcing his way into the conversation much earlier than anyone expected. But once the actual throws started piling up, the conversation around Sanders changed even more dramatically. What's making people inside Browns camp pay attention isn't just that Shedeur Sanders is completing passes. Plenty of quarterbacks can look sharp during off-season practices. Plenty of players can hit open receivers in shorts and helmets. That alone doesn't change the atmosphere around an organization. What's surprising people is the way Sanders is throwing the football, and more specifically, the level of confidence behind every decision. Because there's a massive difference between a quarterback playing carefully and a quarterback playing like he belongs. Early reports from these OTA sessions described Sanders attacking the middle of the field aggressively instead of settling for safe throws outside the numbers. That matters because NFL defenses are designed to punish hesitation in the middle. Young quarterbacks often avoid those windows early in camp. They hold the ball too long. They second-guess themselves. They drift backward in the pocket, looking for safer options. But Sanders reportedly hasn't looked scared of those moments at all. And honestly, that may be the biggest surprise of the entire offseason so far. Coming into the draft process, one of the loudest criticisms surrounding Sanders was whether his arm talent would truly translate at the professional level. Critics questioned the velocity. Some analysts claimed he relied too heavily on timing and anticipation in college. Others argued he might struggle once NFL defenses closed throwing lanes faster. Fair or unfair, those narratives followed him into Cleveland. Now suddenly, practice observers are describing a quarterback driving the football into tight windows with real conviction. Not floating passes, not surviving reads, driving them. That changes perception quickly. One particular sequence reportedly stood out because it showed exactly what Todd Monken's offense demands from its quarterbacks. Sanders stepped up inside the pocket instead of escaping backward, moved cleanly through multiple progressions, then fired a throw over the middle with enough velocity to beat the coverage before it closed. That's NFL quarterbacking, not college freelancing. And when coaches see a young quarterback processing information quickly while staying aggressive, it grabs attention immediately. But the confidence goes beyond the throws themselves. Observers also noted how calm Sanders looked, operating from uncomfortable positions. There were moments where the pocket compressed, defenders crowded the throwing lane, and the easy decision would have been to throw the ball away. Instead, Sanders reportedly stayed balanced, adjusted his platform, and delivered the football anyway. Those are the kinds of small details coaches obsess over because pocket confidence is incredibly difficult to teach. You either panic under pressure or you don't. And right now, Sanders doesn't appear rattled. What makes this even more fascinating is how quickly the energy around him seems to be growing. Quarterback confidence is contagious during camp. Receivers start running harder routes when they trust the ball will arrive on time. Offensive linemen respond differently when they believe the quarterback understands protections. Even coaches begin opening more of the playbook once trust develops. That process usually takes time. But according to reports coming out of Berea, Sanders may be accelerating that timeline far faster than expected. At the same time, it's important not to overreact to every OTA throw like it's a playoff game. This is still early. Defenses are limited, installations are basic, veterans are working back into rhythm. Nobody should be declaring a starter in May. But there's a reason the conversations around Sanders feel louder after each practice instead of quieter. The confidence looks real, and sometimes that matters more than raw statistics ever will. Because once a quarterback starts believing he belongs on the field with NFL veterans, the entire trajectory of a competition can change almost overnight. But then came the interception that completely split Browns fans, analysts, and even practice observers. The moment the interception happened, the entire conversation around practice changed instantly. One play, one tipped ball, and suddenly Browns media, fans, and analysts were all arguing over the exact same question: who was actually responsible for the mistake? Because depending on who you ask, the play either exposed a rookie quarterback forcing a dangerous throw or revealed a receiver and quarterback still learning each other's timing. And honestly, that's why the debate exploded so fast. At first glance, the interception looked bad for Shedeur Sanders. The ball was picked off after targeting Jerry Jeudy across the middle, and whenever a young quarterback throws an interception during camp, the reaction is immediate. Social media clips start circulating, narratives start forming. Critics jump on it instantly. For some people, the play became instant proof that Sanders was still struggling with NFL timing and coverage recognition. But then people started slowing the play down, and the more the sequence got analyzed, the more divided opinions became. According to reports and breakdowns coming out of practice, Jeudy had created separation on the route, not massive separation, but enough for the throw to work if both players stayed synchronized. Sanders reportedly delivered the ball on time based on the route's expected spacing. The issue came at the final moment, when Jeudy appeared to hesitate and adjust awkwardly as the football arrived. That tiny hesitation changed everything. Instead of continuing smoothly through the route, Jeudy reportedly slowed and jumped back toward the football, which caused the pass to deflect into the air. Once the ball tipped upward, the defender had an easy interception, and immediately people started arguing about whether the mistake belonged to the quarterback or the receiver. Some fans blamed Sanders anyway, because quarterbacks always get blamed first. That's the reality of the position. Fair or unfair, interceptions usually stick to the quarterback's reputation long before anyone studies the details. But others, watching the play closely, argued the ball placement actually looked reasonable considering the timing of the route. And that's where this gets interesting, because the play may have revealed something positive about Sanders despite the turnover itself. Young quarterbacks who panic often completely miss the read. They throw late, they stare down targets, they fail to anticipate separation before it happens. But according to several practice observations, Sanders actually appeared to process the play correctly. He identified the opening, trusted the route timing, and released the football decisively. The breakdown happened after the decision was already made. Now, does that mean Sanders was perfect on the play? Not necessarily. There's still a legitimate argument that he could have released the ball slightly earlier to eliminate any chance of the defender reacting. NFL windows close incredibly fast, and elite quarterbacks survive by throwing with anticipation before receivers fully break open. That's part of the learning curve every young quarterback faces. But there's a major difference between a reckless mistake and a timing issue. And many people watching that rep believe this looked much more like a timing issue. Honestly, these kinds of misunderstandings are normal during OTAs. This is exactly why teams use off-season practices to build chemistry. Quarterbacks and receivers are still learning each other's movement patterns, adjustments, and pacing. What matters most isn't whether a single tipped interception happened in May. What matters is how quickly the players correct it afterward. And based on reports from practice, there didn't appear to establish a starter in the quarterback competition. But they also understand that how a quarterback responds afterward absolutely does. And interestingly enough, what happened later in practice may have created an even bigger reaction than the interception itself. If the interception created debate, the Denzel Boston play created excitement, real excitement, the kind that spreads across a practice field in seconds and suddenly has people whispering to each other on the sideline. Because for one moment during OTA practice, a rookie receiver didn't just look promising, he looked dangerous. And it happened against real competition. That's the detail Browns fans shouldn't ignore.
According to reports from practice, Denzel Boston lined up against a veteran defensive back and absolutely won the rep from start to finish. Not because of size alone, not because of a blown coverage, but because of technique, timing, and route detail that looked far more polished than many expected this early in the offseason. The route reportedly started with Boston attacking vertically off the line, forcing the defender to turn his hips and commit outside. Then came the move that changed the entire rep. Boston sold the deep release hard enough to pull the corner completely into the wrong direction before snapping back across space and creating separation almost instantly. Once the defender opened his hips, the play was basically over. And that's what caught people's attention. Big receivers are supposed to win contested catches, that's expected. But when a 6'4" target starts creating separation with clean footwork and sharp movement skills, the entire evaluation changes. Suddenly, he's not just a red zone option anymore. Suddenly, he looks like a receiver who can create real problems for NFL defenses in multiple situations. That's why the reaction around the play became so strong. Reports suggest the catch itself looked effortless once the separation was created. Smooth tracking, strong hands, controlled finish, the kind of rep that instantly earns respect during camp because veterans know how difficult it actually is to separate cleanly against NFL-level defensive backs. And quietly, another important detail emerged from the sequence. The chemistry between Sanders and Boston looked natural. That matters more than fans sometimes realize during off-season practices. Quarterback-receiver trust takes time to build, timing has to develop, anticipation has to develop. But certain combinations just look comfortable early, and according to people watching practice, this connection immediately stood out. It also created an entirely new conversation about Cleveland's receiver room. Because entering the offseason, most of the attention centered around established names like Jerry Jeudy, Cedric Tillman, and Amari Cooper rumors from previous roster discussions. The rookie receivers weren't expected to dominate headlines this early, but now Boston is suddenly forcing people to pay attention, and if these flashes continue into training camp, the Browns may have discovered another weapon far faster than expected. What makes this even more interesting is the timing of the play itself. It happened shortly after the interception discussion started dominating conversations around Sanders. And instead of looking rattled afterward, reports suggest Sanders stayed composed, engaged with coaches, and continued operating confidently throughout practice. That response matters. Coaches watch body language closely after mistakes. They want to see whether quarterbacks spiral mentally or reset immediately.
And according to observers, Sanders never looked shaken. In fact, some reports claim he spent time talking through details with coaches immediately afterward, while continuing to stay involved between reps. Again, that doesn't automatically make someone a franchise quarterback, but it does reveal how serious a player is about speeding up his development. Young quarterbacks who succeed early in the NFL almost always develop this reputation first. They become known for absorbing information quickly. Coaches trust them because corrections don't have to be repeated constantly. Veterans respect them because preparation becomes visible. And over time, those little details quietly influence how an entire locker room responds to a player. That's why this situation feels more important than a normal offseason hype cycle. Because the Browns aren't just evaluating throws right now. They're evaluating command, professionalism, consistency, how quarterbacks respond when they're not the center of attention. Those things become incredibly important during real quarterback competitions because eventually talent alone stops separating players. Habits do. What makes this even more interesting is that the reports around Sanders haven't described someone acting overwhelmed by the pressure. If anything, the opposite seems true. There's a growing sense that he arrived in Cleveland expecting to compete immediately, not simply sit quietly and develop in the background. And honestly, you can usually feel the difference when a quarterback believes he belongs. The urgency looks different, the body language looks different, the preparation becomes visible to everyone around the building. That confidence starts influencing teammates, whether they admit it publicly or not. At the same time, this isn't a situation where Deshaun Watson has completely disappeared from the competition. That narrative would be dishonest. Watson reportedly had several impressive moments during these practices too. Certain throws reminded people why his arm talent was once considered among the most dangerous in football. There were reportedly flashes where he fit passes between defenders with real velocity and anticipation. Nobody inside the building is pretending Watson suddenly forgot how to play quarterback. But there's a difference between isolated flashes and sustained rhythm throughout practice. And that difference keeps coming up in reports from these sessions. Observers continue describing Sanders' practices as steady, connected, and controlled from rep to rep, while Watson's strongest moments reportedly arrive more sporadically. Coaches notice those patterns quickly because consistency is what ultimately wins games in the NFL, not occasional highlight throws. That's why the energy surrounding this competition is starting to change, not because one quarterback has already won the job, that would be ridiculous after a few OTA sessions, but because people inside and outside the organization are beginning to notice a pattern forming earlier than expected. And once momentum starts building inside a quarterback competition, it can become very difficult to slow down. The most important thing Browns fans need to avoid right now is turning this into a cartoon version of the quarterback competition, because despite all the excitement surrounding Shedeur Sanders, Deshaun Watson is still very much part of this story. And according to reports from practice, there were multiple moments during OTAs where Watson reminded everyone exactly why Cleveland invested so heavily in him in the first place. The arm talent is still there. Observers described several throws that looked sharp, aggressive, and confident. There were flashes where Watson reportedly drove passes through tight coverage with the kind of velocity very few quarterbacks can generate naturally. On certain reps, the timing looked crisp, the anticipation looked real, and for brief stretches you could still see the version of Watson that once terrified defenses across the league. That's what makes this situation so complicated, because this isn't a case where one quarterback looks completely finished while another dominates every practice. If that were true, the competition wouldn't even be interesting. The reality is much more uncomfortable for Cleveland, because Watson still flashes high-level ability. The problem is that the overall momentum surrounding the position seems to be shifting anyway. And momentum inside the NFL matters more than people think. Quarterback battles are emotional environments. Coaches may pretend everything is purely analytical, but human reactions always become part of the equation. Players feel energy changes. Teammates notice which quarterback the offense responds to more naturally. Receivers notice who delivers catchable balls consistently. Defenders notice who forces them to stay disciplined every snap.
And right now, the overall tone around Sanders feels like it's steadily growing, while Watson's evaluation feels stuck in a different place. That doesn't mean Watson has been bad. In fact, some practice reports suggest he looked healthier and more comfortable than he did during stretches of last season. The mobility appears improved. The arm strength still flashes. There are legitimate reasons for Cleveland coaches to believe he can still operate this offense effectively if everything clicks. But here's the issue. The strongest descriptions surrounding Watson's practices keep sounding temporary. A few great throws, some flashes, a strong moment here or there. Meanwhile, the reports surrounding Sanders keep focusing on rhythm, command, and consistency across multiple sessions. That difference matters enormously. Coaches don't build offenses around occasional brilliance. They build them around predictability. They need to know what they're getting every rep. Can the quarterback stay on schedule? Can he manage the offense cleanly? Can he repeat good decisions over and over again without the entire structure collapsing after one mistake? Right now, that's where Sanders appears to be gaining ground. Another interesting detail from practice involved the tipped interceptions showing up across multiple quarterbacks during sessions. Reports suggest there were additional deflected balls during drills, including one involving another young quarterback in the room. Coaches study those plays carefully because tipped passes often reveal deeper issues involving timing, trajectory, release speed, or placement.
And interestingly, the Browns staff reportedly didn't treat Sanders' interception like some catastrophic failure compared to the others. That alone says something about how they may be evaluating the situation internally. There's also the psychological side of this competition that people rarely discuss openly. When a young quarterback starts stacking good practices early, excitement builds naturally. Fans start talking, media coverage shifts, teammates begin responding differently. Suddenly, every positive rep feels amplified, while every mistake from the veteran gets analyzed more harshly. That doesn't mean the rookie has officially won anything, but it absolutely changes the emotional pressure surrounding the room. And Watson is now operating inside that environment. For years, he was expected to walk into Cleveland as the unquestioned face of the franchise. Now, for the first time in a long time, there appears to be genuine curiosity about whether someone else could eventually take control of the future. That's a very different kind of pressure. And while the quarterback battle continues dominating headlines, another important reality is quietly developing around the rest of the roster too. One reason this quarterback competition suddenly feels so important is because the Browns roster around it may actually be stronger than people outside Cleveland realize. That's the part getting completely overshadowed by the non-stop focus on Watson and Sanders. Quietly, through these early OTA practices, there are signs this team may have far more offensive and defensive firepower than the national conversation gives them credit for. And if that's true, the quarterback situation becomes even more fascinating. Because young quarterbacks develop much faster when the environment around them is stable. One of the biggest hidden advantages for Cleveland right now is the running back room. Reports coming out of off-season practices continue describing a deep, physical backfield that could become a major part of Todd Monken's offense this season. And for any quarterback, especially a young one, a dangerous running game changes everything. Defenses can't sit in split coverages all game when they're terrified of getting punished on the ground. They can't constantly drop extra defenders into passing lanes if the running backs are consistently creating explosive plays. A balanced offense forces hesitation, and hesitation creates easier throws for quarterbacks. That's where this becomes extremely interesting for Sanders specifically. One of the strongest areas of his game has always been intermediate timing throws, quick reads, rhythm concepts, attacking soft zones before defenses can recover. If Cleveland's running game becomes legitimate, those passing windows become even easier to exploit because linebackers are forced to respect play action and downhill movement. And based on observations so far, the Browns appear determined to build an offense that creates those exact situations. The receiver room suddenly feels deeper too. Obviously, there's already attention around established names like Jerry Jeudy and Cedric Tillman, but the emergence of younger weapons like Denzel Boston is adding another layer of intrigue.
If Boston continues developing quickly, Cleveland may have stumbled into a much more dangerous receiver rotation than people expected entering the offseason. That matters because explosive offenses rarely depend on one star alone. They become difficult to defend when multiple weapons start emerging simultaneously. And the energy around the defensive side of the ball has reportedly been strong as well. There's growing optimism surrounding several defenders returning healthy, while younger players are reportedly creating noise during practices with their speed and physicality. Observers have mentioned increased explosiveness from players working back from injury, along with defensive depth that appears stronger than last year's public perception suggested. That's a huge deal for quarterback development too. Iron sharpens iron during camp. When young quarterbacks face aggressive defensive looks every practice, the learning curve speeds up quickly. They're forced to diagnose pressure faster. Timing improves. Pocket awareness improves. The entire operation becomes sharper because mistakes get punished immediately in practice. And honestly, that may be one of the underrated parts of what's happening in Cleveland right now. This doesn't look like a rebuilding roster waiting 3 years to become competitive. It looks like a roster trying to win immediately while simultaneously discovering that a young quarterback may be developing faster than expected. That combination can create serious pressure inside an organization because it forces difficult decisions much earlier than planned. If the team struggles, the calls for change get louder quickly. If the team looks explosive during preseason action, the excitement around Sanders becomes impossible to contain. And if Watson plays well while Sanders continues improving behind him, the Browns suddenly possess something most NFL teams spend years searching for: legitimate quarterback depth with upside. That's why these OTA practices feel bigger than normal offseason headlines. This isn't just about a few flashy throws in May. It's about the possibility that Cleveland's entire long-term direction could be changing in real time, while the rest of the league is still treating this like a routine offseason storyline.
And after only 3 practices, one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. 3 OTA practices should not decide an NFL quarterback competition. Everybody understands that. It's May. Pads aren't even on yet. Defenses are limited. Veterans are still easing back into football shape. And yet, despite all of that, the conversation surrounding the Cleveland Browns has already changed dramatically after just a few sessions in Berea. Not because someone officially won the job, not because the coaching staff made some huge announcement, but because the energy around this competition no longer feels predictable. When OTAs first began, most people assumed this storyline would follow a familiar path. Deshaun Watson would gradually settle back into control of the offense, the younger quarterbacks would gain experience behind the scenes, and the Browns would move toward training camp with a relatively clear hierarchy at the position. That's not what's happening. Instead, every practice seems to be creating more discussion, more curiosity, more debate, and the center of that conversation continues circling back to Shedeur Sanders. The biggest reason isn't even the highlight throws themselves, it's the consistency being described by people watching these practices closely. The quick processing, the confidence attacking tight windows, the calm movement inside the pocket, the way teammates reportedly respond to him, the way coaches continue giving meaningful opportunities instead of limiting the competition early. Those details matter. And while Sanders has absolutely generated excitement, this story still remains complicated because Watson continues flashing real talent too. There are still moments where his arm strength, anticipation, and experience jump off the field. Anyone pretending otherwise is ignoring reality. But football decisions aren't made based only on isolated moments anymore. They're made based on patterns. And through these first OTA sessions, the pattern people keep describing feels increasingly difficult to ignore. Sanders looks comfortable, not overwhelmed, not tentative, not like a rookie simply trying to survive camp. He looks like someone who arrived believing he belonged in the competition immediately. That mentality changes everything, because confidence spreads quickly inside NFL buildings. Once teammates begin feeling it, once coaches start trusting it, and once momentum starts building publicly, the pressure surrounding the entire quarterback room shifts. That's exactly where Cleveland suddenly finds itself. Then you add the bigger picture around the roster, the improving receiver depth, the strong running back room, the defensive talent returning healthy, the possibility that Todd Monken's offense could become far more explosive than people expected. Suddenly, this no longer feels like a rebuilding situation patiently waiting years for development. It feels urgent, and urgency changes how organizations evaluate quarterbacks. Now, none of this guarantees Sanders becomes the Browns' starter tomorrow. There's still a long road ahead: mandatory minicamp, training camp, preseason games, real pressure situations. Veterans usually respond once the competition intensifies. Watson still has opportunities to fully reclaim control of the offense, and reports coming out of OTAs should always be viewed carefully because offseason hype can disappear fast once real football begins. But something undeniably changed over these first 3 practices. The quarterback competition stopped feeling symbolic. It started feeling real. And if the current trajectory continues, the Browns may eventually face a decision much bigger than anyone expected when this offseason first began. Because sometimes franchises enter OTAs believing they already know their future quarterback situation, only to realize a few practices later that the future may already be standing on the field in front of them. If you made it this far, drop your honest opinion in the comments right now. After everything we've seen through these first OTA practices, who do you think is truly leading this competition? Was the Jerry Jeudy interception more on the receiver or the quarterback? And how real do you think the Shedeur Sanders hype actually is right now? If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because things inside Browns camp are getting more intense by the day.